No surprises in the Falcons' first round of cuts, but could some surprise trades be looming?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for nearly 2 decades, formerly at FalFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first watch or your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to be talking about some pass rushers and pass catchers that may be on the Falcons' radar via the waiver wire or trade market. Could the Falcons be looking to make another big splash on defense with a trade for a new starting linebacker? But first, we'll talk about the first round of cuts that the Falcons made on Sunday afternoon, with 13 players being released. The Falcons still have 24 more cuts to go to get down to that 53-man roster limit ahead of Tuesday's 4 p.m. Eastern time deadline. But the 13 cuts that they were made were quarterback John Paddock, wide receiver Josh Ali, tight ends Austin Stogner and Jordan Thomas, offensive lineman Jared Jones-Smith, John LeGlue and Zach Bailey, edge rusher Bradley Anai, linebackers Donovan Mooten and Story Jackson, cornerbacks Trey Vavall and William Hooper, and safety Lucas Dennis. So nobody in this list should be a surprise. None of these guys I projected to make the team. Nearly all of these guys were basically the quote-unquote backups in the preseason finale against the Jaguars, which, you know, for the most part, they weren't getting on the field for the first time until the second half of that game. And usually if you're not getting on the field until the second half of the last preseason game, that's usually a strong indicator that you are not going to make the team. Now, some of these guys I thought had possible potential outcomes as like practice squatters. Someone like a Lucas Dennis, I still think is got a decent chance of making the practice squad, but we'll sort of see on that front. But you know, this is the first round of cuts, and we'll probably get some more. Probably, I would assume the Falcons will wait till Tuesday, or, you know, we'll see what happens on that. But, you know, one of the other interesting cuts I thought with Donovan Mooten, because he played so well against Jacksonville, and I thought, you know, maybe because the Falcons are a little beat up at linebacker, you know, Kaden Elliss, Nate Landman are day-to-day with groin and quad injuries, that, you know, maybe that could lead the Falcons to keeping 5 off-ball linebackers on their 53-man roster, just as insurance going into that week 1 game in the event that either one of those guys, Ellis or Landman, aren't 100%. But given that there's like 10 days of rest between now and when we get to a first official injury report for the Falcons on September 4th, ahead of that Steelers game, you know, it's probably fine. Like, those guys should be fine. You know, if it's just a day-to-day injury, 10 days of rest should be good enough for those guys to be ready to go come week 1. But probably the most notable out of these 13 cuts, besides Lucas Dennis and Donovan Mooten, is John Paddock, right? And it's mostly because of the question of who's going to be the QB3. Is that going to be Taylor Heinicke? Does cutting John Paddock solidify Taylor Heinicke as that QB3? And does that mean Taylor Heinicke is going to be part of the Falcons 53-man roster? Again, the answer is maybe, right? You know, to me, there was never really a world where I thought John Paddock would beat Taylor Heinicke out for that job or anything like that. So, you know, the fact that Paddock got cut doesn't really move the needle in that regard. To me, Heinicke's sticking is really about whether or not the Falcons want to keep Heinicke as a third quarterback. Do they get a trade offer? Those types of things that we just don't know. But, you know, Heinicke is not a slam dunk to stick. You know, I still think he's likelier to stick than not. Like, I've always kind of felt like his chances of making the roster were somewhere in like 60, 65, you know, maybe 68% range or something like that. You know, And I don't think that changed, after today or whatever. It's just always been in that range. So it's like more likely than not that Heinicke will be on the roster this year. But again, there's still like a 30 to 35% chance or 40% chance that the Falcons could move on from him. So we'll see. We'll see. And again, I think that possibility that the Falcons move on from Heinicke, is more likely to happen rather than the Falcons just cutting him, is if someone wants to trade for him. And again, as we discussed on yesterday's episode, I don't think the trade market is going to be robust for Taylor Heinicke, but like the one team I continue to circle is like the Rams. And I could imagine the Falcons making a player for player trade between, for Heinicke. We give you Heinicke, you give us one of your players. Now, I personally think that player is more likely to be Tutu Atwell, but another player is on the, trade market right now, and that's Ernest Jones. And let's talk about the viability that the Falcons make another big splash via trade with Ernest Jones as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So in the NFL, guys, you're looking for the right quality professionals that are going to fit your team, and that's what training camp and the preseason is all about. And if you're own a small business, you're looking for the same thing. You want those quality professionals, but you don't have to worry about training camp and preseason because you got LinkedIn Jobs. They're going to help you find the right professionals to fit your team faster and for free. They're not just any old job board. LinkedIn's going to help you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but just might be open for the perfect role, right? Think of it like, guys are on the waiver wire just waiting, by the phone, and all of a sudden, boom, LinkedIn gives you a call, and you get to scoop those guys up off the waiver wire, and they wind up being the perfect fit for your team, right? And over 70% of LinkedIn users don't use other leading job sites, right? So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. 86% of small businesses on LinkedIn get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So on Sunday morning, news broke that the Rams middle linebacker Ernest Jones has been given permission by the Rams to seek a trade due to him wanting a new contract going into his final year of his rookie deal this season. And the Rams just seem to be content, like, no, we'll wait. We'll wait after the season. That's sort of my read on the situation. And of course, because the Falcons just made a couple of big splashes in the defensive market, 10 days ago or whenever that was, I think there's going to be rampant speculation that pretty much any disgruntled defensive player, and especially one that played for Raheem Morris in LA, and certainly a guy that Raheem Morris, I think Raheem Morris, the words were Raheem Morris said it's his team at the end of the 2023 season after Aaron Donald, when they knew that Aaron Donald was retiring. So very high praise for Ernest Jones in that regard. But, I don't think the Falcons are going to make a trade for Ernest Jones or really any big splash player. Again, when we look at the Judon and Simmons moves, those were need positions all offseason, right? We went into free agency. We went into the draft thinking edge and safety were going to be priority position. Maybe not so much the draft, at least here on Locked On Falcons, because we talked about like a month before the draft. Like they're probably going to punt on safety in the draft, and we'll just sort of have to see. But we thought edge was definitely going to be a priority, and we certainly thought safety was going to be a priority going into free agency. And that gets to the conversation that we've been having for 5 months, which is, how complacent this team was, and that we had to wait till August for them to actually make the moves that we thought they were going to make, back in February and March. But, that's not really the case with linebacker. At no point has linebacker been this like, oh, we need to upgrade the starting position, right? And again, I'm sure there are people out there that think they do, but like no one, the consensus has never been, hey, the Falcons have a deficiency at linebacker. We've had several guests on this podcast over the last several months that would be like, the arguably the biggest strength of the roster on the defense side of the ball is the linebacker position. So it doesn't make a ton of sense for the Falcons to target someone like Jones at this point in time. Give up a draft pick, give up a new contract for Jones, which is, the same thing. And again, I know Matthew Judon said like, oh, I'll be willing to pay, play for nothing, or basically I'll earn a new contract. And maybe Ernest Jones would do that, but like, I wouldn't bet on it. Like what Matthew Judon is doing is not the norm in the NFL, as Hassan Reddick will certainly show you. The norm is what Hassan Reddick is doing, not what Matthew Judon is doing, is basically what I'm saying. But, I do think, even though I don't think the Falcons are very likely to have any interest in Ernest Jones today, we could be having a conversation about Ernest Jones 6 months from now, is basically what I'm here to say. That is definitely a possibility because a lot of that depends on the type of year that the Falcons linebackers that are considered a strength of this defense have, right? Do they live up to that or do they disappoint, right? That, the Falcons can get out of Kaden Ellis' contract after this season if they wanted to, right? If Kaden Ellis has a disappointing season, that would be one way that the Falcons could free up, I think, like $5.3 million in salary cap space or something like that next year, right? You have Troy Andersen, and Nate Landman still under contract. Andersen on his rookie deal through the 2025 season. Nate Landman will be a restricted free agent after the season, but assuming that you want to keep him, he should be back in 2025. So both of those guys are cost control or under contract through the 2025 season. But who knows after the season if you're going to look at those guys through the same lens that we're looking at them now as, 3 pseudo starters, as Raheem Moore said it earlier this summer. We might be like, yeah, no, I think they're more backups, right? Like that may be the situation after the season. And if that's the situation, then, Ernest Jones to me makes a lot more sense in that situation where you're much more willing to pay him. He's going to be 25 or 26 at that point in time. So still young, like 4 years younger than Kaden Elliss will be at that point in time. So it would make sense. Similar skill set in terms of the pass rush ability that Kaden Elliss brings to the table. So to me, 2025, Ernest Jones, yeah, sure, I could see that as a possibility. 2024, not so much. Now, we'll see what the Falcons' current group of linebackers wind up doing. As I mentioned earlier, Ellis and Landman are dealing with some injuries heading into week 1. That's important because, this week 1 game against Pittsburgh, because of the likelihood that Arthur Smith, the Steelers offensive coordinator, former Falcons head coach, is going to be very committed to running the football. This is one of the few matchups this year that Nate Landman actually adds plus value. It's like this one, the Chargers, maybe the Saints, depending on how much Clint Kubiak is trying to channel his inner Shanahan with an offense that's going to use a lot of what's the right word? Big personnel groupings, fullbacks, tight ends, and whatnot that are going to force the opposing defense to play a lot of base defense. And that's where Nate Landman shines, which is as that sort of downhill run defender. But at the same time, we're also kind of waiting on Pittsburgh to decide what their starting quarterback is going to be, because if Justin Fields starts the game, then that means that Troy Andersen is going to be a little bit more valuable for that week 1 matchup, just because you need to have an athlete like Troy Andersen to sort of spy on the quarterback. And that's why, you've heard me say several times over the last several months and last year, if we're, Team Edward versus Team Jacob, to go back to Twilight, take it back 15 years to the Twilight Wars. But like, Team Andersen, I am Team Andersen, and, Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta is Team Landman. When it comes to that, we got to ship our guys. But, the reason why I'm Team Andersen is just not because I believe Troy Andersen is going to be this great player. It's because the Falcons need Troy Andersen to be this great player if their defense is going to be good, right? Just because he's going to bring so much more value to this defense because of his ability to cover running backs and tight ends, his ability to spy mobile quarterbacks like Justin Fields, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels later in the season. There's a reason why the Falcons struggled against mobile quarterbacks like Justin Fields and Kyler Murray and Josh Dobbs last year, because they didn't have an athlete like Troy Andersen on the football field, not to mention, the potential plus value of Troy Andersen bringing as a blitzer and a run defender and all that stuff. So, as I said, when we drafted Troy Andersen, the best version of the type of player that he is, not saying he's going to be this player, but the best version of that type of player is Fred Warner, right? Now, is it likely that Troy Andersen's ever going to get to the Fred Warner level? Probably not. Like, it's very low probability. It's very low probability of any linebacker getting to Fred Warner's level, which is arguably, a Hall of Fame caliber linebacker based off of how that position is played in the modern football. So yeah, that's a low probability, right, to begin with. But could he get to Troy Andersen? That is, could he get to like halfway to Fred Warner's level? Like, if that's the case, I'll take 50% of Fred Warner at this point. Like, that would be a win if you ask me, right? A poor man's Fred Warner for the win. Like, I'll take that. A win is a win, baby. So we'll see if Andersen lives up to that level of hype. Again, it's a big maybe, as we've discussed many times over the offseason. Like, Andersen and Arnold Ebiketie, to me, are the 2 best bets that the Falcons could make as far as breakout potential, but that doesn't necessarily make them good bets, right? It's just, you're betting on traits, you're betting on upside. But, any Falcon fan that has been a Falcon fan for any amount of time knows that, like, hey, betting on traits and upside with the Atlanta Falcons, especially on defense, has worked out so wonderful for this team in the past. This is by no means a guarantee for success. So we'll see. So I think it's definitely possible that we could see Ernest Jones in a Falcons uniform in 2025. It's possible, but probably not in 2024. Now, I think Jones is one of several, current Rams that are going to be free agents after this season that we could see the Falcons pursuing. And that includes not only Ernest Jones, but Michael Hoyt, Bobby Brown, and then on offense, potentially Tutu Atwell. And there's been rampant speculation for months that the Rams could trade Tutu Atwell. I think it makes sense for the Falcons to answer that phone call, to ask Tutu Atwell to be their wide receiver 6. The current guy that's likely to be that guy is Chris Blair. He's had a good summer, but, I think Tutu Atwell brings a little bit more of a known commodity, as well as adding a little bit more value on special teams, being that second kickoff return guy next to Avery Williams, especially if Ray McLeod is going to be on the pitch count this year, like the Falcons had their return specialist last year in that regard. So that to me, it gives you another body, right? Basically replacing the Rondale Moore role, which was supposed to be Jakeem Grant, but then he got hurt. And so now it's like, okay, well, third time's the charm with Tutu Atwell. So to me, like, if we're talking about realistic trades with the Rams, it's not Ernest Jones, it's Tutu Atwell that to me is the more realistic trade. Now, again, there's been a lot of talk that the Rams aren't necessarily willing to trade Atwell, but like every Rams beat writer, or at least I won't say every, but at least the handful of Rams beat writers that generally are highly competent, like basically the people that work for ESPN and The Athletic. And not to sit here and say that there aren't other people out there, right? Locked On Rams does a great job. But, everybody seems to acknowledge, yes, the Rams are open about, hey, we aren't planning on trading Tutu Atwell, but everybody seems to basically be like, but Tutu Atwell's very expendable. And of course, if the Rams get a decent offer for Tutu Atwell, that makes sense. And so that to me is where the Heinicke stuff comes in, where like it makes some sense from both sides, right? You have two players that you're lukewarm on, and you're just like, yeah, we don't really need this guy at this point in time. The Falcons with Heinicke, because we have Penix, the Rams with Atwell, who's basically, with the emergence of guys like Xavier Smith and Jordan Whittington and Tyler Johnson, like the Rams will be fine at wide receiver, right? Atwell's going to be the number 4 wide receiver at best in LA this year. So like they could move on from it. And so like, because the Rams, Jimmy Garoppolo, their backup quarterback, is suspended for the first 2 games, and everybody seems to agree that, yes, Stetson Bennett has made progress this summer, but is not quite ready to step on a football field in the event of an injury to Matt Stafford those first 2 weeks. And again, the probability of Stafford going down and Bennett having to play those first 2 weeks is low, very low, like 5%. But like, you got Dave Ragone there, the Falcons former OC, now the Rams quarterbacks coach. You have some familiarity there. So Heinicke is definitely more ready to play. And certainly, like, you don't need Heinicke to learn the offense. Like, Heinicke's going to beat Taylor Heinicke. Like, he's going to play Taylor Heinicke. He's not going through progression. So, like, the offense is whatever the offense is. And we know Sean McVay can work with a quarterback that may be limited, that he might have to whisper into their headset a little bit, right up to tell him where to throw the football. But we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I think it makes sense for both sides if you wanted to do a player for players trade, which I think is probably more likely at this point for the Falcons than some big sexy splash move like Ernest Jones would be, and then having to give him a big contract on top of that, or at least feeling compelled to give a big contract. But maybe the Falcons could talk him out to be like, hey, go out there and pull a Matt Judon and earn it, my guy. And it's like, all right, I was going to do that in LA, but I guess I could do that now in Atlanta. But it is what it is. But so we'll see. So that's one trade proposal that I think is more realistic in terms of the Atwell trade rather than the Ernest Jones trade. But Atwell is not the only wide receiver that I have my eye on, as well as could the Falcons be still in the market for another pass rusher, even after making the Matt Judon trade. And there's a couple of guys that I have my eye on as we get closer to final cuts, and we'll break down who those guys are as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, I want to tell you even more about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because there's now something different than, the usual shenanigans that FanDuel is up to, right? They're up to even greater shenanigans, because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And when you get that YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. And as a YouTube TV customer and an NFL Sunday Ticket customer, I cannot highly recommend it enough, right? As an out-of-market person, I want to be able to watch Falcon games. If you're also out of market, like so many, like 60% of this audience is, like you kind of, if you're a sicko, you got to get Sunday Ticket. And even if you're in market in the state of Georgia to watch Falcons games, right, and you just want to check out other players and other teams, Sunday Ticket is there for you. So check it out, in addition to all the great lines and betting options at FanDuel. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So I think there's a couple other trades that the Falcons could make, right? Could they be making more trades for pass rush help? It's possible. Again, I wouldn't bet on it, but I would say it's possible. There's 3 guys I have my eyes on, right? Julian Okwara with the Eagles, Jake Martin with the Bears, and James Houston with the Lions. Now, I mentioned Houston before we made the Judon trade as a sort of cheap trade option that could help the Falcons pass rush. The Lions tried to make him into a Sam linebacker this summer. It didn't really take. So he's just going to go back to being a designated pass rusher, which is what he was before. He was very productive in that role in 2022, where he had 8 sacks, basically as a designated pass rusher, and then missed most of last year with an injury. And so, wasn't able to repeat on that. And so the Lions are like, we need you to do more than just rush the quarterback, my guy. And he's like, that's what I do. Sorry, I'm having a fake conversation between James Houston and Dan Campbell. This is what this podcast has come to. But yeah, he's like, this is what I do. And like, if you're the Falcons, you're like, well, we'll take a guy. We don't need you to do anything else other than rush a quarterback here in Atlanta. So we'll take that. But that makes sense to me. Okwara and Martin are 2 guys that are being projected to be cut by Philadelphia and Chicago, respectively, at least looking at the 53-man roster projections that have come out over the weekend from ESPN and The Athletic for both of those teams. Okwara is also an ex-Lion, had 5 sacks with the Lions back in 2021. Then injuries kind of derailed his last 2 years there. Martin's claim to fame is basically being part of the Jadeveon Clowney trade that sent him from Houston to Seattle 5 years ago. And he's a solid sort of situational designated pass rusher. His best season came in 2021 when he had 4 sacks and 38 pressures. So basically a Lorenzo Carter production in that year. But, every little bit helps for the Atlanta Falcons. And I would argue 2 Lorenzo Carters is better than 1, right? And I personally think having another Lorenzo Carter is more valuable than having a James Smith-Williams. That's just my personal opinion. But, opinions may vary. So I could definitely love to see the Falcons upgrade, that edge rusher spot, adding another body there. Will we see that? Probably not. But, they'll probably more than likely roll with the 4 guys that they have, including Lorenzo Carter, James Smith-Williams, Arnold Becchetti, and Matt Judon. The question is going to be, do they keep a 5th guy? Is that D'Angelo Malone? Is that Damon Harris? That 5th guy is primarily going to probably play special teams and probably won't get too much action on defense. But, of that trio of guys that I mentioned, Jacob Martin has the most experience playing special teams. So he could come in, slot in, play some special teams, and then eventually work his way into the defensive line rotation once the Falcons realize, like, oh, yeah, James Smith-Williams, like, there's a reason why this guy only had 1 sack last year. Yeah, that's probably not going to add too much juice to our revamped defense. So, we'll see. We'll see on that front. But not only is it pass rushers, there's also a couple of pass catchers I have my eye on, on the waiver wire that are expected to be cut. One player, Juju Smith-Schuster is another player we've mentioned before that's already been cut, has familiarity with Ike Hilliard from his days in Pittsburgh. 3 wide receivers in Houston that I'm keeping my eye on and that are projected to be cut by the Texans: Ben Skoranek, Steven Sims, and Robert Woods. Skoranek and Woods played for the Rams. Steven Sims also played for the Steelers, has return experience. So again, going back to that Tutu Atwell, Rondale Moore, Jakeem Grant role as that wide receiver 6 that can also, return kicks and whatnot. That makes a ton of sense. So like, I could see the Falcons scooping up any of those guys. But, I think if the Falcons do make a trade, it won't be another splash like they did with Judon, right? I think if they are going to make a trade, it's going to be for another cheap veteran, probably someone with close to veteran minimum salary, right? Over the Cap currently projects the Falcons salary cap space of about $7.6 million. Based off of my current cap projection, or my current roster projection, that will go down to about $6 million when we get to week 1. But again, that depends on the cuts. That could be $6 million, it could be $8 million. It kind of depends on what happens with D'Angelo Malone and Taylor Heinicke are probably the two most expensive players that are on the bubble at this point in time. And keeping those guys, cutting those guys frees up about $1 million for each one of the 1.2, I think, for each one of those guys. So, that's where the 6 to 8, you can bump that 6 to 8 if you cut those guys. But, we know that teams like to have a little bit of wiggle room with the cap going into the season. Usually $5 million is the number that people throw around as sort of your floor for that. And so if we're talking about $6 million, that's really only about $1 million to spend. If we're talking $8 million, that's maybe like $3 million to spend. And so that's why, I think you're more likely to see the Falcons go after guys that they can get for veteran minimum deals, like $1 million, $1.5 million or something like that, rather than a big splash move where they would have to pay a guy much more than that. So, obviously, because the salary cap is a lie, they could move money around and whatnot, but I don't think they're in a rush to do that at this point in time. So we'll see on that front. But, I do think, talking about these wide receivers, mentioning specifically 4 guys, or if you want to throw Atwell into the mix, 5 guys that have familiarity with this coaching staff and this offense, to me makes the most sense, especially given the relatively short turnaround that you're going to need on those guys. And especially many of the guys I mentioned, minus Woods and Smith-Schuster, at least can add some special teams value for you potentially, which is probably where you're more likely to get those guys to contribute early in the season. And then as they get more comfortable, maybe once we get to October, you could start to see those guys maybe make contributions on offense. So we'll see. We'll see on that front. But more than likely, I don't think we're going to see the Falcons make any big splashes at final cuts. But, one of these guys, one of these trade offers, one of these guys is going to get cut. You offer a conditional 7th round pick or something like that for some of these guys, or you offer a player for player trade, like in the case of Taylor Heinicke. It makes a ton of sense, and you can get these guys for $1 million or less than $2 million, and so that's not going to require Terry to do the thing that we know that Terry doesn't love to do, which is move money around. So we'll see what the Falcons do. Tomorrow we should be joined by Corey Woodruff, and we'll nerd out about the roster, and we'll talk about our 53-man roster projections, assuming that the Falcons haven't officially made those moves by the time we record that episode, that's always the fluid situation where you got to time it. It's like, are we going to cut these guys? And then are we just talking about the cuts, or, are we projecting the actual cut? So that is in store for you on tomorrow's episode. And then we'll find out what those final cuts are. And then, it's on to Pittsburgh. And I have some thoughts about the Steelers and that week 1 matchup. So we'll start to get into that by the end of this week, but continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen so that you don't miss, all of our roster nerding out, as well as upcoming week 1 thoughts here on the podcast. If you want to get insight into Justin Simmons and what he's bringing to the table, I should be having a video on him coming out very shortly for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. To become a Locked On Falcons Insider, click the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You'll get access to that. You'll get access to my film breakdown of Matt Judon. You'll get access to my film breakdown of not only Kirk Cousins and the Vikings offense, but the Rams offense, as well as my post-draft film breakdowns of all the Falcons draft picks, going all the way back to my extended all 22 reviews last season. We'll do extended all 22 reviews this season. So all that is in for you as a Locked On Falcons Insider, not to mention you get my reaction to these moves first before you get them on the podcast. So check that out. 14-day free trial. You can try it out for free. Get all that content for free for 14 days. If you like it, keep it and, pay $4.99 a month thereafter. Or you can move on and, live the rest of your life, wondering where you can get great Falcons content and having to live with yourself for turning down that opportunity and whatnot. But guys, that is going to do it for us here. Check out Locked On Fantasy Football as your second listen, Locked On Sports Atlanta for your second listen. Hey, Georgia Tech, they did some things. What's Georgia going to do this upcoming season? Check out Locked On Bulldogs to get that insight. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.